moly, do we have a fascinating one today. For a change, Ben Smith on his new book, Traffic. This is for all you sophisticates like me who know the ins and outs of the history of how in the 2000s New York City became tech's media center. These were smart, cool sophisticates, creating things like Buzzfeed and Gawker and HuffPo, and the new kind of social media. These people were hip, they were clever, they were gossipy and flirted at hipster parties, just the kind of thing I had no clue about. That's why I found Traffic so at times fascinating and other times kind of disturbing. These were smart hipsters who took no prisoners and changed history, and one of the smartest and actually most responsible, one of them, Ben Smith, is with me to discuss their remarkable successes and failures in the early era of social media. Another word for traffic was clicks, and clicks are good. Clicks were money. The more clicks, the more money. They're all getting lots of traffic, you see, but then something happened. Facebook and Google kind of ruin it all because they're getting so many clicks that the value of a single click becomes much smaller, and these smaller websites stop making money. As Ben says,
that is a perfect summary. The core problem was that we were selling this commodity that turned out to be unlimited in its quantity, and so the price went down.
Now, Gawker went out of business because the guy who started it, Nick Denton, had a different kind of ethic. Gawker had a different ethic, as Ben described it. It was, quote, to rip the mask off the hypocritical mainstream. People didn't want to read high-minded politics. What they really wanted was pornography. And Gawker published a video of Hulk Hogan having sex with his friend's wife. And, well, Hogan sued and Gawker lost. Well, billionaire Peter Thiel financed that lawsuit and put Gawker out of business. Now, that's the salacious highlight of the book and of this podcast. But Ben Smith moved on from Buzzfeed to the New York Times and has a very serious, well-sourced, well-resourced news organization, Semaphore. And you should definitely check that website out for a top-of-the-line news source that isn't the New York Times or the Washington Post. So here we are with Ben Smith and Traffic. It's a great one, for a change. Okay, Ben, thank you for joining the podcast here. We'll talk about your book, Traffic, and talk about your new, what do you call Semaphore? It's a new, what's the terminology for that kind of thing?
News organization?
News organization, that's what it is.
We used to say website, but it's no longer so simple.
Okay, is it a news organization that is a website, though?
Well, it's a news organization that has a website, but more people read us in email.
Okay. All these are the distinctions that I should really be so conversant in and am not conversant in. And let me just from the very start of this say that I'm a little embarrassed that I did not know this stuff. I just didn't know this. I didn't know BuzzFeed very well. I didn't know what was the Gawker. I didn't know Gawker very well. I knew HuffPo pretty well because I know Ariana, but I didn't know this world at all. And so this whole book, a lot of it was news to me, and some of it was gossipy, I will say. And when I was a kid, I was told not to gossip. That didn't stop me from gossiping.
There's a prohibition in Jewish law against it. In fact,
is there?
That I've occasionally been admonished about. Yeah, it's called Lashon Hara.
This is funny. When you remember Buck Henry, who hosted a lot of SNLs early on. So first year of the show, like early on, we're sitting at Pastrami and Things, which is a restaurant then at 30 Rock, and he's just gossiping. And I go like, I don't gossip. And he says, I only gossip. And I thought like, That's great. I love Buck. One, it was a joke, but also so there's a lot of gossip in this book, but it's also a lot of information about very important stuff. And the gossip is a lot about the culture. You start the book with this guy Jonah Peretti, and he's buying some Nike shoes, and you could put something on the side of the shoes. They custom print your shoe, right?
Yeah. It was, he was a grad student at MIT, and he was in the parlance of the day, which is the early 2000s, a culture jammer, I think is how he would have identified. If you remember that, it was sort of like anti-corporate pranksterism.
No, but yes, okay. Now, I mean, I didn't know the term until
there's a magazine called Adbusters. I feel like I was faintly aware. Anyway, Jonah is this clever grad student who's a little bored, and Nike is doing a promotion, which would then felt really radical and technically interesting. You could put your name or another word and have it enter a form on the internet, and they would print sneakers with that word. And so he put the word sweatshop.
Well, first he put fuck, right?
Right. First he put profanity and was told he couldn't do profanity. And then was put sweatshop, and a customer service representative wrote him and said it violated the terms of service, and he couldn't do that either.
He said it wasn't a word or something, and then he said, yes, it is a word.
Yeah, actually, it is a word.
Exactly what it means.
Exactly.
Yeah. And
they go back and forth for a while. And finally, with this sort of pained customer service person explaining to him why he can't do it. And finally, he concedes that he's not going to, that they won't make the shoe, or they won't put the word on it, but could they still send him just a blank shoe along with a picture of the 7-year-old Vietnamese girl who assembled it?
Right.
And then he thinks this is very clever. And so he tries to, and when you've written something clever in 2001, what you do is you submit it to Harper's Index, the front of a widely read general interest magazine, and that assembles clever things, and they reject him. And so he just emails it to a few friends because he's sort of proud of himself.
Yeah, here, see, this is funny.
Yeah, and that was the early sort of social media. People forward it to other people, and pretty soon it's one of those insane email forwards from that era that has gone everywhere. And he's on the Today Show debating a Nike representative about sweatshops, which he knows nothing about. And he has this feeling of like, what just happened to me?
And they said we don't use Vietnamese girls, we use Burmese girls, the guy said.
Well, what they actually said was, we're just so glad everybody's talking about our products, which was actually very kind of ahead of their time.
That's right. Well, that's one of the lessons here is that you just want traffic. You don't care whether it's good or bad sometimes. Now, you were BuzzFeed. When did you start BuzzFeed with Jonah, or
Jonah started it, but he brought me in 2011 from Politico to start a news operation there.
Okay, and you guys had a news operation, and a pretty serious news operation. Now, there's this other guy, other actor in this book, Nick Denton, who sort of had a different ethos. Would that be a correct way to put it?
Yeah, I mean, because what Jonah sort of saw was that, and what he thought and what BuzzFeed was rooted in, was that people would basically share funny, positive, lighthearted stuff that they would share to show how clever they were, to show what good people they were, but that it would sort of be basically positive. Just because what kind of crazy person would go out in public and yell about politics? No one. So, obviously. And Nick Denton, who was a British journalist who'd tried to start some tech companies and then moved to New York in the early 2000s also, had this totally different idea, which was that the thing that this new digital media could do was sort of rip the mask off of the hypocritical mainstream. I mean, it was as he's getting going, it's sort of the throes of, and then the Iraq War. There's this huge sense that the mainstream media, particularly the Times, has totally screwed it up.
Yep, they did.
And so there people are interested in alternative voices and people who are going to tell you what's really going on, not the sanitized version. And Denton sort of saw that digital media could do that, and also saw that it could, using these metrics of traffic, it could tell you, it could kind of rip the hypocrisy off the audience too. It could tell you, it could say, look, people say they want to read about high-minded politics, but really they want pornography. And so he started a porn site. Mm-hmm. Just give the people what they want. And that was sort of more his ethos.
They did gossip too, right?
Oh, for sure. Yes. It was fun. It started as kind of a media gossip blog, but I think he rejected the distinction between news and gossip.
Yeah. And this is why I I can't swear it was Gawker, but I think it was Gawker. So one day, something appears. Someone points out Al Franken seen in this restaurant arguing with his daughter's boyfriend. And I knew what the restaurant was, and it was actually my son and my daughter were there. And my son and I weren't arguing. We were discussing. We had this ongoing, argument about whether you could have a space ship or like a space station up in geosynchronous orbit, and we could get fiber that was strong enough that you could, instead of having to do a launch to send something up there, you could just send it up on like a space ladder, a ladder from Earth to this thing. And so my son was an engineering major, and he'd go, "Dad, you can't, there's no tensile strength that's going to, and blah, blah, blah." I go, "How do you know? How do you know?" And
that sounds like really boring gossip.
Really boring gossip, but it's not even gossip.
Right, it's sub gossip.
So I'd get mad. I go, "That's not gossip," and I'd just get mad at this shit. And that was me.
Yep.
And so I wasn't paying enough attention to this stuff, all this stuff. Now, just let's make it clear that the traffic is the number of clicks. Is that right?
Yeah, it's a measure of how many people have visited each person kind of
have clicked
downloading a copy of a thing from your server, which is a click. Yeah.
That's a click. Okay. So I've always thought of clicks and, so I wasn't looking at that stuff. I was looking, I guess I was on the Judiciary Committee and on Antitrust Subcommittee. And I was really interested in things like, Facebook and Google and Amazon having such a huge footprint in all of this shit. And monopsony. I think I was the first member of the Senate to use the word monopsony, which is Amazon. To sell anything, you had to sell to Amazon, right? So that's a monopsony. Then, so they have, instead of control over people who are buying from you, you have control over people who are selling to you. That's right.
Yep.
Said.
Makes sense to me.
But basically, what happens is these Buzzfeed, your company, and Gawker runs into trouble. We'll talk about that in a minute. But all these HuffPo are getting an incredible amount of traffic, and it's making a profit. But then, and this is very generalized summation of your book, of a part of your book, is that Facebook just kind of ruins it all, and I guess Google too, because they're just getting so many clicks that the value of a single click becomes much smaller, and you guys stop making money. Is that right?
Yeah, that's actually that is a perfect summary. The core problem was that we were selling this commodity that turned out to be unlimited in its quantity, and so the price went down.
Yeah, and then therefore, you guys had BuzzFeed went out of business.
BuzzFeed News did. BuzzFeed still exists.
It's news operation. I'm sorry. That's very different. And Gawker, of course, went out of business because they made a mistake, but it was part of his hubris. Is that a characterization that's somewhat accurate?
Well, I think it kind of followed the logic of that kind of expose everything to a conclusion that was really legally dangerous, which involved publishing people's sex tapes.
So he published a sex tape of Hulk Hogan with someone that was a friend of the family or a wife's friend?
Very complicated. Yeah, he was. Okay. He was Hulk Hogan and his friend's wife, I believe.
Friend's wife.
But I think the point was it was private, and a jury ruled that this is not something that anybody should publish.
That suit was sort of financed by this well-known billionaire.
Yeah, Peter Thiel led a real conspiracy to destroy them, and the ammunition they gave him was publishing sex tapes.
And so that put Gawker out of business.
Yes.
Okay. You know Frank Foer, of course.
Yes.
A great journalist now for the Atlantic. Well, at one point, Frank was working for the New Republic, and one of these guys a rich guy from Facebook, bought the New Republic, which had to be bought very frequently because it doesn't make money. And this guy had a lot of money, of course. And so they had this newsroom, and Frank was the editor, became the editor.
Yep.
And this guy had the most high-minded ideas for the New Republic. But then he put in, and I can't remember how Frank described it, but some machine that would like make a sound every time they got a click or a certain amount of clicks. And what's getting the clicks? And it kind of totally undermined everything because everyone's going like, what got the fuck click? Oh, shit. And it just sent the play. They started going like, oh, and he, the editor who had bought this thing and had all the money in the world and could lose money, just suddenly went click crazy. Do you know this?
Yeah. But I think this isn't something entirely new to the world, that someone in the media business is led down a garden path by trying to get as big an audience as possible.
Oh, I thought that was the first time.
Yeah, not the first time in history, but there was something like, it's like everybody in media had always, in news had always obviously been thinking about their audience in some ways, but suddenly like you were flying with the instruments on and you'd been flying by sight before and you could see every little detail and you could see, I don't know. And I think people in some ways took the lessons too literally. And the obvious logical conclusion of that is just you give people exactly whatever they want at all times. You lose your own identity in just pandering relentlessly to what people want.
Yeah, I know. It's like the New York Times on Monday reports like SNL this week had so-and-so play Bush for the first time, that kind of stuff. Yeah, people click on that, right? Or this is a sketch, and it doesn't feel like the New York Times. It doesn't, but what's the harm, I guess. So, but that gets clicks, and that helps pay for the New York Times, which is doing very well, and is hiring a lot of people who were in this world, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the surprises in writing the book is sort of realizing, the winner of this whole episode of history is the New York Times, which had,
the incumbent media
15 years ago would have said they were going out of business, and instead they were patient. They kind of watched and waited. In particular, sort of technical, but they waited for Spotify and Netflix to train us all to pay for things on our phones, to pay for content on our phones. And once everybody in the world was sort of used to that, the Times was able to charge us, and we paid in a way that 10 years earlier, it seemed like it was very complicated to try to pay for something on your phone, or that you didn't have a phone, in fact, that you could do that with. And so the Times, learned all the lessons of this era, probably for better and worse, absorbed all the lunatics, including me, who had sort of worked in this wide open digital world, spat a lot of them out again, but that's the New York Times.
A lot of lunatics like Ezra Klein and
maniacs,
Swisher, just nuts.
Absolutely. No one should ever hire these people. But honestly, people who, it is kind of interesting though, because it was people who had kind of learned their trade on the internet, who didn't necessarily have the Times' core values about what journalism ought to be, but in some ways had come up raging about Thomas Friedman columns and hated the Times, right?
Yeah, but these are pretty serious people. I mean,
for sure.
What I mean?
Oh, serious people, but not creatures of the New York Times, I think. And it's, it's true of them, it's true of me, it's true of a guy named Corey Sika, who helped found Gawker, a bunch of other people who sort of went to the Times for a while, reporter named Taylor Lorenz. So
that's a great blend in a way, and it works. It works beautifully, right?
No, I think everybody, as like the sort of politics of media got very intense in the summer of 2020. One of the things that happened, I think, is that the Times sort of tore itself apart in public, in part because it had hired lots of people who had different values and thought differently about journalism and didn't have a kind of internal consensus or set of values, and really tore itself apart a bit over. And actually, virtually all the people you mentioned, I think except for Ezra, are no longer at the Times.
I want to ask you about something about Cambridge Analytica I think I heard you with Kara Swisher, so I should remember if she's not with the Times. And you were talking about how the myth that Cambridge Analytica and I guess the St. Petersburg Russian group, what was that called?
Oh, the Internet Research Agency?
Yeah, the Internet Research Agency did not affect the election. I'm not arguing with you here, but I didn't really understand the explanation of that.
Sure.
To prove it. Let me tell you what I thought I heard you say, is that the Russians, through the Internet Research Agency, took out ads, and famously they bought them in rubles. You know, the Facebook prides itself in having like all the data in the world, but they couldn't put rubles together with a foreigner buying ads, which is illegal, political ads in an American election. So, but you say that they took out a lot fewer ads than the Trump campaign on Facebook. But to me, that's not necessarily a proof point. Because, of course, the Trump campaign is going to take out a lot of ads. They're the Trump campaign. And the Russians, I think, are trying not to get caught. And probably, even though they're, for some reason, buying these in rubles, which I thought was a tell, they can't buy anywhere near as many as the Trump. But here's what I'm asking is the Mercers set up that deal where Cambridge Analytica gave that Russian guy this data, right, of 85 million Americans, right?
No, this is a bunch of...
That's honestly, not true.
Like, this is like a ChatGPT summary of a bunch of different things that happened.
Okay.
The Russian guy was a American academic who I think had been born in Russia and who these allegations did ruin his career and his life.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Didn't have any. Let me give you my version of this, and you can poke holes in it because I'm not the world's leading expert. But I think like there is this after the 2016 election for totally reasonable reason. Well, actually, let me start here. WikiLeaks does appear to have been Russian directed and was like the most successful intelligence operation in history. In recent history, had a huge impact on the campaign.
Absolutely.
The Russians did really meddle in ways that were illegal and messed up, and they also, in much less meaningfully, started a bunch of Facebook accounts that took out ads on Facebook. But you know, if you watch, say if you're watching TV for 24 hours and you see 97 ads for Donald Trump and one for some weird other thing that sort of supports Trump, like that's kind of the relative impact of the Russian stuff. It's not that it didn't exist. It's not that it wasn't their intention to help Trump, because it was.
Well, it was the only way for them to communicate with people to take out ads.
Yeah, they also had lots of fake accounts. They were doing all sorts of stuff to fan the flames of American division and everything else. This is my own perspective in retrospect. It's pretty clear we were massively doing this to ourselves and didn't really need their help. And I think if you look at how high impact WikiLeaks was, and then a third thing is Cambridge Analytica, which was a consulting company. I'm sure you dealt with this kind of company all the time in politics that made grand claims about how they had some cool technology that had swung the last election and were con artists. And journalists reasonably heard them say, we have this cool psychographic tools where we got all this data that we're not supposed to have from Facebook. And that part was true. And we swung the election this way and that. The British government actually did a very, very comprehensive report on them because they were meant to have also somehow worked with the Russians. The narrative never made any sense, but somehow they worked with the Russians. They stole Brexit. They stole Trump. And the British government looked into it in great detail and really found they were incredibly shady. They had a bunch of data they probably shouldn't have had that they'd gotten from this Russian-American academics research project. And they couldn't do any of the things they claimed to have done, had no impact on anything except in, conning people like the Mercers out of money. And it is one of the situations which actually are fairly common in the media where a con man is so good that you sort of reporters fall for the marketing hype is I think what happened there.
Okay, well let me ask you this part. Okay, so Manafort goes to Columnist, right? And this part of the Mueller report, and gives them the internal polling from the campaign in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. And of course, the election was won in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania by very narrow margins in each state.
Yep.
Now, if you have the data, and you're saying there was no cross-pollination of the Cambridge Analytica data between Cambridge Analytica and the Internet Research Agency. Is that what you're saying?
What the British government report found specifically was just that Cambridge Analytica was not doing anything any other ad agency on Facebook. They were doing the same stuff as everybody else. They were buying ads, and they didn't have special tools. They were just claiming to get money from people like Donald Trump and Ted Cruz.
But here's my question. They know what black people have expressed in Milwaukee, have expressed interest in Black Lives Matter, say. Okay? Couldn't the St. Petersburg Internet Research Agency have used that data, but you're saying there was no interaction, but couldn't they use that data to target those people with, Hillary called young black men super predators? Because it was the undervote among blacks in Detroit and in Milwaukee and in Philadelphia that decided this election.
I mean, everything, close election, everything decided it. They could have. And I think but these are researchable, provable claims, right? Like there's a massive apparatus of social science that is meant to understand how thing one influences thing two. And the Russians spent, in the end, Trump was pouring massive amounts of money into exactly the sort of racially divisive and vote suppressing ad campaigns that you describe. The Russians were spending an incredibly small amount of money doing the same thing, basically the same thing. And it is, again, wildly inappropriate, and who knows, criminal or not, to give your internal polling to a foreign power that's trying to swing the election.
That's certainly
nobody's
illegal.
Defending that. But you didn't need Donald Trump's super secret internal polling, by the way, to understand how the election worked, right? I just think that I think there's a big gap between these sinister intentions and evidence that that's what swung the election, as opposed to, I think you see it, a lot of people really like Donald Trump.
Oh, no. But it was so close. And 84 million people's data, and you can use that data to target those people much more precisely.
You can't even, I know that makes sense, and you say it, and people wrote that years ago, but it just turned out not to be the case. You could not use that data to no one ever did. It just sounds so good that these con artists went around saying, we have all this magic data nobody else has. This is the conclusion of a lengthy British government report that had access to everything and looked deeply into it.
Okay. Well, they're.
But I do think, this is just not to hijack your podcast with my hobby horse, but I do think there are these basically there's these very clear, satisfying ideas about what Russia did that are partly true, but it just kind of seeped into the culture, and a lot of the details are wrong.
Well, those are dangerous things, and I wanted to clarify that. And
But I'll stop with that is a random specific hobby horse of mine that I will now get off.
Okay. Well, I brought it up. So now you have Semaphore, which is you're attempting to do something very serious here, serious news. Although I checked on it today, and the head story was Prince Harry and Meghan Markle are not getting along with King Charles and Queen Camilla.
No, you that is a false statement. Although that sounds like a good story.
That was a joke.
Yes, thank God. Sorry. I did just hit the website and say, "Oh my God, what did somebody do?"
Oh, you fell for my joke.
I totally fell for it.
Okay, well, I would say that certain people would say that was an obvious joke.
I used to run Buzzfeed, and people would say, "Do you know what's on the top of your website?" And it was never a joke. So I guess I have a.
Okay, I see what you're saying. No, that was a joke. No, I've been sampling semaphore, and it's very serious.
It's very serious.
You would never lead with that, but I'm glad I got you there. All right. So Facebook and all these other Google and all these other places that are getting zillions and zillions of hits put the Buzzfeeds and the Gawkers and HuffPos sort of out of business in at least a certain aspect.
Yeah, I think that's
business.
exactly right.
Okay. And what else do you want us to take from the book?
To me, and particularly in sort of a political sense, the most interesting thing was to go back to that period that, you were right in the middle of, where there was this sense that like the new internet was a progressive place. Like fundamentally, the internet is a place that's going to support Howard Dean, and then it's going to bring us Barack Obama. And it did. And Obama owned the internet, right? I mean, he wasn't like truly a populist, but the most populist position of that moment on the left was opposing the Iraq War, and he did. And so he got this surge of energy from and for lots of other reasons too, including, being the first major Black candidate for president,
and having talent.
Yeah, and being and being interesting and charismatic and young. All these things.
Talent.
Talent, yes, just being Barack Obama.
So the internet loved Barack Obama. And it was just actually, if you were in Huffington Post was founded explicitly in part to get a Democrat the nomination in 2008, or to the presidency in 2008. Let's get the nomination. And so there was this assumption that this is just, and Obama visits Facebook in 2011, just kind of to say thanks. And it was like visiting Madison, Wisconsin. You don't have to explain that Facebook is full of Democrats. It's just obvious in that moment, because that's where college kids go. And then, a few years later, it's equally obvious that Barack Obama isn't the apogee of this whole new digital media. It's Donald Trump. And when I went and kind of looked back, I guess the two things that really surprised me, one were just how much the people who created this new right-wing internet were there all along. Andrew Breitbart, one of the key figures, co-founded Huffington Post. The founder of 4chan worked out of Buzzfeed's offices for a while. The founder of the Proud Boys also founded Vice.
Hey.
And on and on. And, Steve Bannon was hanging around.
That's a shanda. Scene. Boy, what a shanda for the Goyim.
Indeed.
Goyim being the people in that business at that time.
So I don't know. I never know how Jewish to get on these podcasts. I guess I started pretty Jewish here. I am Jewish, I should say. So all those people are there all along. And the things that we perfected, like the things that we obsessed about in terms of like figuring out traffic and following traffic where it led to a point, but to the point where you're still doing journalism, this new right-wing populism was just perfectly tuned to just follow the energy wherever it led. And who cares about the old rules and the old institutions? If immigration, which the anger about immigration that the Republican Party had sort of kept in a box, if that was what got the traffic, Breitbart was going to follow it kind of to its logical conclusion. Of a story about an undocumented immigrant killing someone is the most read thing on their site. They're just going to keep doing them. Yep. Trump the same. And then the other thing was this style globally, really, of populist right-wing politics, where the style is to say something really transgressive, whether it's a lie or something shocking or insulting, in order to generate intention and conflict and to show that you're not one of these insiders, as Trump did all the time. Facebook was perfectly tuned to amplify that. Facebook was technically structured to amplify what they called engagement, which really meant if I post something stupid and racist and you say you're a racist and then I comment, no, you're a racist, the machine says, wow, these people are having such a great engaged conversation. Let's show this content to more people. Yeah,
that's a really interesting conversation. I want to see that one because it's gotten a lot of clicks already. No, you're racist.
And that was essentially became the entire substance of Facebook by 2017.
Let me ask you, the Supreme Court recently just came down with a decision on a couple cases about that weren't specifically about Section 230, but kind of were. You know what I'm talking about, right? Section 230.
I know what Section 230 is.
Yeah. Well, the court just came out on a couple of families whose relatives, I think kids, were killed by Al Qaeda, were sued 2 different internet providers for putting out these stories about Al Qaeda that were kind of promoting Al Qaeda.
Mm-hmm.
I can't remember what they were. There were some big, whether it was Facebook or not. But it's the thing of these. Facebook knows exactly what it's putting out. Its algorithms are putting out to people what will keep them engaged. And the algorithms know you better than you know yourself, right? Because they know every click you've ever made, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so if they know, and they know from that if someone is like loves to be agitated, they'll agitate them and to keep them on. And so they'll feed them something that just ain't true. They'll feed them, this is why a lot of people think that elites drink the blood of children that they've kidnapped and tortured.
Yeah.
If Facebook knows what it's sending out, if the algorithm knows that it's doing that, I don't know where Facebook gets to say, we don't know what we're sending out. Do you have an opinion about 230?
I mean, so 230 is the foundation of like the whole internet as we know it, basically.
Yeah, it was in the Internet Decency Act of like 1995 or something, right?
Yeah, and it's like this structural layer. Like if you ever had a blog and wrote a blog, the company that hosted the blog can't be sued if you say something stupid. And if they could, they wouldn't have. You couldn't have had a blog ever. And then that translates into social media. If you ever posted a YouTube video or watched a YouTube video, that only exists because YouTube can't be sued, for the content on your video.
It's a platform. It's not a publisher.
Right. And I think if you think the internet, digital media, like if you have any position that is not, we really ought to just go back and, the last 25 years were a total mistake. I mean, I sympathize with that. The very simplistic, we should abolish Section 230 stuff doesn't make any sense, I think. And I don't think that sort of like we've got to find a metaphor from the 20th century for what is a Facebook or a YouTube. Like I think it's a new thing. It's a new kind of thing. And that said, the principle of the platforms is, well, this means we should have no accountability forever for anything we do.
Right.
That's obviously not tenable either. And so I think the actual solutions tend to be pretty complicated and in the middle, which I realize is kind of an unsatisfying point of view.
Well, I'd like to give me a element of a complicated solution.
Platform, there's legislation that says that platforms with more than 100 million users, which is very few, have to report regularly to Congress in great detail on exactly what's happening inside their platforms so that regulators can have transparency and can see what's going on. Like, because that's the thing that doesn't exist right now. But if you pass that broadly, like you've got to, not everyone, like you and I should probably not be writing regular reports to Congress on what's happening on our own Twitter account.
That would be killing to any new thing, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so that's one. I mean, the most interesting thing that's happening right now, I think, is sort of a slightly different angle on this, which is if you watch the TikTok hearings, a lot of what legislators asked the CEO of TikTok was basically, you guys run a similar service in China, but in China, there's no sex, there's no violence, everything is very, very wholesome. Why can't we have that here? And, the answer is because they have an authoritarian government that totally controls the internet. But I think that there is actually a lot of interest in the United States and in the West. I mean, I think that there was this old perception that you could not control the internet. Bill Clinton famously said that what China was trying to do was like trying to nail Jell-O to a wall. Like that just turns out to be wrong. You can, technically. And I think there's a lot of appetite in the West, and this freaks me out a bit, but is also clearly happening in real, to say, hey, look, like in China, they've got this thing under control. That like it's not in principle particularly harder to regulate the internet than it is to regulate like fisheries, which I don't know much about either.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the place you're seeing that first is pornography. There's a bill in Utah. There's actually new legislation in France to say that pornography should be age gated. And actually, if you ask people, should 11-year-olds be able to like watch hardcore pornography? Everybody says no. And if you have a vote in a state legislature on that, it's 100-0. And I think that you're going to see that start to take effect in a real way over the next year or two. And I think that once, first they come for the pornographers, right? And then I think you'll start to see more serious regulation of the rest of digital media.
Well, congratulations on this thing. So what else would you like me to ask you? See this is a seamless podcast.
Some
what else
questions.
would you like me to ask you? But I do that all the time. We didn't mention Matt Drudge.
Matt Drudge is a big character. I mean, I think the sort of prehistory of this whole moment that I was writing about, which is the early aughts in New York, it begins there. The prehistory of that really is Matt Drudge, who's, again, and I at least imagine that you feel some of this too, which is that the sort of 90s media, which were these self-righteous, self-important gatekeepers who got lots of things wrong and never admitted it, were kind of loathsome. And it was incredibly exciting, actually, to try to find forms of media that challenged that. And I think there was a huge appetite for that in the audience. I mean, Air America, which you did, was that. And Drudge was another thread of an attack on the media establishment, essentially, who, came out of the sort of right-wing fever swamps of the Whitewater and the Clintons, and essentially got a tip that Newsweek was trying to decide in one of these classic kind of decisions gatekeepers used to get to make, whether or not to publish a story about the president having an affair with an intern. And he basically took it upon himself to make that decision for them. Mm-hmm. And really both made himself very famous and really shook gatekeepers' confidence in their ability to kind of keep the gate, which is a big shift, I think, in, for better and for worse. And I think sometimes it felt for better. Right now it probably feels for worse in how the internet changed media. There are all these there are constantly arguments happening at places like the New York Times about, like, should we write the story about this woman, Tara Reid, who says Joe Biden sexually assaulted her? And my view on that was always, like, the stakes are way lower than you think. You're arguing about this as though your readers will have not already heard this somewhere and be trying to understand and put it in context. And you're having these decisions as though the only source of information they have is the print New York Times dropped on their doorstep. And if you don't put something in there, it doesn't exist.
Right.
When in fact, love it or hate it, and often hate it, the same people you're talking to have all these other sources of information. And the best you can do often is help them navigate that stew of stuff.
That's right. That's right.
Imagine that so that's a very tricky position.
Because she said laudatory stuff about Putin and how masculine he was. There was some stuff that she was saying that was pretty out there and discrediting to her, I thought.
Yeah, the Times, you can never, it's very, you don't always get to the absolute bottom of things. The Times wound up doing a very thorough story, that I think people read and believed her a bit less having read it.
Yeah. Drudge. Okay. So here's my Drudge story. Didn't have many of them. So I was at a White House Correspondents' Dinner. I can't remember which one. And I did two of them. So this is in the 90s. And I got there to the hotel very late. So I had to shower and get in the tux, right? And shave very fast. And I cut myself a little shaving, a little nick. Didn't realize that it was bleeding so much when I got down to the ballroom. And then later in the evening, I went over to see Alan Combs and urge him to stand up to Hannity more. Mm-hmm. And Kilmeade came over to me and had this argument with me. Brian Kilmeade from Fox News, which, was somewhat of a heated argument. I went, okay. So Drudge wrote a thing that I was seeing after arguing with Kilmeade. We had a fist fight, and that I was bleeding. And I thought, I don't like this.
Wait, did this go on the website?
Yeah.
And you could, and this isn't a Section 230 issue. That's defamation. You could have sued Matt Drudge.
I suppose so. No, I just didn't feel like it was worth it. And I bet, yeah.
It's a very strange experience, right?
Yeah. And, that's worse than I was arguing with my daughter's, boyfriend. But, it was just, I just would see things like this all the time. Yeah. And I just hated it. And I was a victim of it in a bigger way later. So anyway, congratulations on this thing, which is a book. Thing's a book. Traffic.
The thing is a book.
So far as I can tell.
Thank you, and it's really good to talk to you.
Yeah, good talking to you. Well, I hope you enjoyed listening. That beautiful music is by Leo Kottke, the great Leo Kottke. I want to thank Peter Ogburn for producing this podcast. We'll talk again next week.